All right, Ninja Nerds, in this video we're going to talk about the skeletal muscle fiber types. Okay, so when we take a look at a skeletal muscle, most people think it's just muscle fibers. Well, technically, those muscle fibers or those muscle cells, they differ. Okay, so for example, what I wanted to show you before we get into each one of these actual muscle fiber types, because that way I can actually completely clarify something. Let's say I take the actual muscle. If you guys remember from the structure of skeletal muscle video, we took the section of a muscle belly. Then we had inside of the muscle belly, we had those bundles of muscle fibers called a fascicle. Well, right here, this whole bundle here, a cross section of it, this is our fascicle. So this whole thing right here is specifically the fascicle. Now, in this fascicle, there's consisting of multiple muscle fibers. Now the thing is that each one of these muscle fibers are not all the same. They can differ. So for example, we're going to talk about three main types of muscle fibers. Type 1, Type 2A, and the last one, which will be Type 2X. Now some people will be like, oh, well, what about Type 2B? Type 2X is mainly in humans. Type 2B is in other different types of animals. So in this video, we're going to talk about Type 1, Type 2A, and Type 2X tissues, okay, or skeletal muscle fibers. So when you actually look at each one of these structures, it might look like a big muscle. But technically what I'm trying to represent here is that this is a muscle fiber type, this is a muscle fiber type, and this is a muscle fiber type. Okay, so that we're clear. All right, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to start here with this skeletal muscle fiber type, and we're going to denote this one to be Type 1. Okay, so this skeletal muscle fiber type is specifically Type 1. Now here's the thing. Type 1 skeletal muscle fibers also have another name. And we'll decipher that name as we go through its different types of structural characteristics and metabolic characteristics and really what it's functionally for. And that name is called slow oxidative muscle fiber. Okay, so this is a slow oxidative muscle fiber. And sometimes they even add on to it, they say red slow oxidative. I'll do that just for the heck of it. I'll put that right here. It's technically red slow oxidative. That's really going to help us to decipher what makes this skeletal muscle fiber type different from the other two skeletal muscle fiber types. All right, the first one, let's go ahead and go through each one of these skeletal muscle fiber types in a specific order. Okay, so structurally, how is this type 1 skeletal muscle fiber different from these other two? Well, the first thing about its structure is that if you guys notice, this muscle fiber is a lot smaller than the other two. So because this muscle fiber is a lot smaller than the other two, it should be the smallest muscle fiber. So its overall fiber diameter should be a lot less. So if that's the case, then the fiber diameter should be very small. So it should have a decrease or a small, let's actually not put decrease, let's put small fiber, and all a fiber is just a muscle cell, diameter. Okay, so that's one thing. So if you look at the diameter of this guy, as compared to all the rest of these, it's a lot smaller diameter. Okay? That's one thing. What else is structurally different from this one? All right, let's look at its name, red. What is the red really coming from? Now, muscles are highly vascular, but specifically the most special type, the most highly vascularized muscle fibers are the red, slow oxidative muscle fibers. They have a large amount of capillary density. So if that's the case, then let's say I represent this with blood vessels, right? So if that's the case, then this is going to have a large amount of blood vessel supply. This is going to have a large amount of capillary supply. If this has a large amount of capillary supply, then what does that mean for its actual color? That means that its color is going to be a nice bright red. Why is it going to be a nice bright red? The reason why it's going to be a nice bright red is because it's carrying blood through there, right? So if it's carrying blood through there, what's special about blood? Blood is having hemoglobin in it. And hemoglobin is actually what causes the actual blood to look red, specifically red blood cells. So it's having a lot of blood flowing through that area. So because there's a lot of blood, so let's represent blood flowing through here and out here, what type of color is it going to give off? It's going to give off a nice reddish color. And the reason why is because this has a high capillary density. So a very high capillary density. And then again, if that's the case then, if it has a high capillary density, what color would you expect this actual skeletal muscle fiber to exist as? It would be very, very red because there's a large amount of capillaries supplying it. So if that's the case, then it's going to have a nice reddish hue. And hue just is kind of, color. All right? So nice reddish hue. Okay, so what do we know right now? First thing we know, smallest diameter muscle fiber. Second thing we know, high amounts of capillary density, so a lot of blood supplying this muscle fiber. Because there's a lot of capillary density, it's going to have a nice reddish hue. And also think about this. If you have a small skeletal muscle fiber, does it take as many capillaries to actually cause that reddish hue on that structure? No. If I take a big, huge skeletal muscle and I have a decent amount of capillary density, it's going to take a lot of capillaries in order to produce off that reddish hue on a large skeletal muscle fiber as compared to a smaller skeletal muscle fiber. So a smaller skeletal muscle fiber, even though the capillary density is really high, it doesn't take as much capillaries to produce that nice reddish hue as compared to a large skeletal muscle, which requires significantly large amounts of capillaries to produce that same reddish hue. Okay, that's that part. Next thing I want to talk about, what about organelles in this area? What about the organelles? There's a very important organelle that is important for these skeletal muscle fibers. Okay, this organelle is specifically the mitochondria. So let's have here the mitochondria. This one has a significant amount of mitochondria. Very, very significant amounts of mitochondria. Now that's important, and we're going to talk about that when we get into the metabolic characteristics of these guys. But again, I want you to understand that this one has significant amounts of mitochondria. Now, what are mitochondria important for? If you guys remember, mitochondria are really important for ATP production. They're the powerhouses of our cells, right? So because they're the powerhouses of our cells, what are they basically doing? If you guys remember, they can take certain types of energy sources, like what? They can take glucose, they can take amino acids, they can take fats, right? And what can they do with that? They can utilize that and do what? Use that in the presence of what has to be there, though, in order for this reaction to actually occur. You need to have oxygen. You need oxygen. What does that mean when you need oxygen, when a pathway requires oxygen? It's an aerobic pathway. So it's an aerobic pathway. And the overall result out of this is that it'll lead to the formation of ATP. So if that's the case, then if these guys need oxygen and they're metabolizing fats and glucose and amino acids to be able to produce ATP, and they have plentiful amounts of mitochondria, what does that mean for the ATP formation? They're going to have a decently high ATP formation. So these types of skeletal muscle fibers generally produce a significant amount of ATP by aerobic cellular respiration. But let's come back again. What did I say about the mitochondria so that we can continue to keep labeling here? We said that there's a decent amount of mitochondria. So they have a significantly large amount of mitochondria. So large amount of mitochondria. Okay. So now that we've done that, we can relate the structural concepts to the metabolic concepts here. Okay, first off, we talked about mitochondria. What did we say was one of the metabolic characteristics here? Because they have significant amounts of mitochondria, they're primarily going to be depending on oxygen. So the primary way upon which these cells produce energy, or ATP, has to be aerobic cellular respiration. So these skeletal muscle fibers primarily depend upon aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, so for example, they would undergo Krebs cycle, they would undergo the electron transport chain reactions, they would undergo many, many different types of reactions and lead to the production of ATP. By what type of process are they producing ATP? This is under oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so that's one thing. We know that they're very, very dependent upon aerobic cellular respiration. Another thing, because these skeletal muscle fibers are small, they don't really, and before we even do that, what does their name suggest? Red, okay, that means a lot of capillary density, and it means something else in a second. Slow. Oh, you know what? These muscle fibers must contract very slow. And that is true. These skeletal muscle fibers are the slowest in contractility speed. So the rate at which these muscles are contracting are very slow, and we'll see why here in just a second. So again, what is up with the contractile speed here? Very slow contractile speed. So the rate of contraction is a lot lower in this skeletal muscle fiber type. And the reason why is it has a decreased myosin ATPase activity. Okay, we talked about this a little bit in the actual skeletal muscle contraction video. If you guys remember, let's say here I have thin filament, and on the thin filament you have actin. And if you guys remember, we had the thick filament, right? And the thick filament specifically consists of these myosin, right? With the myosin heads that were connecting with the actual actin. Remember, in order for us to detach the myosin, we had to bind ATP. But then what else did we say? Remember we told you that in the first step of that whole process there was hydrolysis? What does that mean to hydrolyze the ATP? Well, you remember we said that it actually is breaking the second and third phosphate, that bond between those two. There's a special enzyme that's actually on the myosin. On this myosin, it has a special enzyme component. And what that enzyme component does is it actually breaks that bond between the ATP and then converts it into ADP and anorganic phosphate, which helps to be able to put it into that cocked position, right? This enzyme that's a component of the myosin, that enzyme, so imagine again, if I draw it over here on the side, imagine here is the enzyme, okay? And this enzyme is actually a part of myosin. It's actually a component of the myosin. And what happens is it's breaking down the ATP. What is this enzyme called? This enzyme is called a myosin ATPase. Now, think about this for a second. If there's the activity of this enzyme is decreased, will he break down as much ATP? No. If he doesn't break down as much ATP, will he be able to detach the myosin from the actual actin very quickly? No. If he doesn't detach it, will he be able to cause the cocked position and then reattach to the next actin quickly? No. And so then will he be able to create the power stroke quickly? No. So the overall concept is that because he's decreasing the myosin ATPase activity, this whole detachment and then hydrolysis and then the whole power stroke and then re-putting on the ATP, that whole activity, the sliding filament theory, is going to decrease. Therefore, the contraction speed will decrease. Another thing to think about, if it's undergoing aerobic cellular respiration, doesn't it have to go through many, many different types of pathways? So it might take a little bit longer to be able to produce significant amounts of ATP. Because you know there's two types of phosphorylation, substrate phosphorylation and oxidative. This cell primarily depends upon oxidative. And oxidative, we already said, produces very significant, large amounts of ATP. Okay. Next thing about this skeletal muscle fiber. We know that it contracts slowly. We know that the speed is very slow. But here's what's really cool about this muscle. Because it contracts slow, it can last a long time. Okay? So because it's contracting very slow, the activity of this skeletal muscle fiber can go on for a long period of time. Not only that, think about energy-wise. If I have enough energy, I can carry out an activity for a decent amount of time. But if I don't have enough energy, that activity won't be able to go on for a very long time. So what two things are contributing to this muscle being able to carry out this activity for a long time? One is the slow contractile speed, and the other one is the large amounts of ATP produced. So therefore, we can say that this one is actually going to be fatigue resistant. Very, very fatigue resistant. High amounts of fatigue resistance. So this muscle can go on for a long period of time, carrying out its activity. If you really want to know, it can carry out this activity for hours. Many hours, okay? Okay, but here's the thing. Because it's fatigue resistant, it actually is not going to be very strong. It doesn't generate a lot of power. And that should make sense because of this decreased myosin ATPase enzyme. So because it's smaller, a smaller diameter fiber, and because of this myosin ATPase activity and the slow contractile speed, it's not going to be able to generate a decent amount of power to move a heavy load. So therefore, because it doesn't have a lot of power, do you know what's called, there's what's called a motor unit? What is a motor unit? What is a motor unit? A motor unit is two things. It's a motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it supplies. Now, there's what's called the size principle, the recruitment concept. And recruitment just means if you have a motor unit, if you have more motor units, you can recruit more muscle fibers. But now let's look at this side, let's look at the aspect of the muscle fibers. Okay? Now, if we look at this from the respect of the muscle fiber concept, not the motor unit concept. If we want to be able to move something, right? Something, really, really heavy, it's going to require, okay, a specific type of activity. But these muscles are very special. And the reason why they're very special is they're not used to carrying very heavy loads. So because of that, they're not used to carrying very heavy loads, these muscle fibers are going to get recruited first. Okay, they're not used to carrying heavy loads. So the order of muscle fiber recruitment, in other words, the motor units, the motor neurons that are actually stimulating those muscle cells to contract, this muscle fiber will be the first one to be stimulated. So type 1 muscle fibers, our red slow oxidative muscle fibers, are the first muscle fiber to get recruited. And the reason why is it produces very little power. So because it produces very little power, you don't really need this muscle to be recruited last. You just want to get through that muscle quickly and then move on to the other types of muscle fibers. Okay, so this is the one that gets recruited first. So again, if we have a motor neuron here, and here's your motor neuron, this motor neuron will actually recruit this muscle fiber first. So it undergoes first recruitment. Okay. So this is the first recruitment muscle fiber. Next concept. Okay, now this skeletal muscle fiber is going to be depending upon oxygen. And one of the pathways that requires oxygen, a decent amount of it, and what's really special about this muscle fiber is because it doesn't undergo anaerobic processes, it's going to depend upon oxygen and it's going to store a special type of storage molecule. And that storage molecule is called triglycerides. It's called triglycerides. And these muscle fiber types are very special because they store a lot of their energy in the form of triglycerides. And if you guys remember, we talked about over here with fats, what do triglycerides actually do whenever they go into the mitochondria? If you guys remember, when these guys go into the mitochondria, they undergo a special process, and that special process is called beta oxidation, right? Specifically the fatty acids. And when they undergo this beta oxidation, what can come out of this result? You can produce tons of ATP. And again, this is the result of beta oxidation, specifically for the fatty acids. And then the glycerol can actually go into a specific glycolytic pathway, and that glycolytic pathway will also lead to the production of ATP. Now, again, if we're looking at these skeletal muscle fibers, their main source of energy storage, of fuel, is in the form of triglycerides. So how do they store their energy? They store their energy primarily in the form of triglycerides. That's their main source of energy storage, is in the form of triglycerides. Now, one more thing. You know, these skeletal muscles have a special protein that it has within it. This special protein is something like hemoglobin. It's something like hemoglobin. It's not hemoglobin, but it's something like him. And this protein is called myoglobin. You see this protein right here? It's smiling at you because it's helping us, right, all the time. Helping out your skeletal muscles. This protein is called myoglobin. And what myoglobin is really cool at being able to do is it temporarily holds on to the oxygen. So whenever blood is flowing through this area, it drops off oxygen to this myoglobin, and the oxygen can bind onto the myoglobin, and the myoglobin can hold on to this oxygen, and whenever the tissue cell needs it, it can drop that oxygen off, right? So whenever it's actually relaxing, the blood is coming to the tissue, it's dropping off oxygen. When the skeletal muscle gets ready to contract, right, we need ATP. So what do you need in order to produce ATP? Oxygen. The oxygen can get used to produce ATP. So we need to have a lot of myoglobin. So the amount of myoglobin and these skeletal muscle fibers should be very, very high. So we should have a lot of myoglobin too, okay? All right, so because these muscle fibers are having to be able to specifically produce lots of ATP, they contract very slowly, they're very fatigue resistant, you're gonna want these to be muscles that you can carry out some activity for a long period of time. So one of the things that most people, if you think about, is marathon runners. So this is very good for those people who are gonna run marathons. So if you're one of those individuals who wants to go and run a marathon, okay, so run marathons, these are some good muscle fibers that are gonna help you in that process. And the reason why is because, marathons, I've never ran one, but from what I understand, you run long distance, right? And so because of that, you're gonna require a lots of ATP production because your skeletal muscle fibers are gonna depend upon that ATP. In order for us to do that, we have to have a lot of aerobic cellular respiration. Not only that, but these muscles are very fatigue resistant because they have a high capillary density, a high amount of oxygen coming to the area, right? And they have lots of triglycerides as a concentrated source of energy fuel. So because of that, that's one thing. But you know what else is really important? Think about this. What is always pushing down on us? Gravity. So because gravity is always pushing down on us, naturally it would want to push our muscles like this, right? So because of that, we have muscles that are constantly helping us to maintain posture and maintain our body position. So those muscles that are our anti-gravity or posture muscles are also really important because they have to do that all day. So if you're standing up a lot, if you're having gravity push down, these muscles are constantly helping you to maintain your normal body posture. So again, we can say anti-gravity muscles or posture muscles. So anti-gravity muscles, and those would be a great example of your posture muscles, okay? Helping to maintain that nice posture. Okay, that's our type 1, our red, slow oxidative muscle fibers.